Welcome. Today's session is on understanding racial stress and trauma in schools, responding by addressing and affirming race. And we are so grateful to have Farsana Salim, Dr. Farsana Salim, who holds many, many, many hats, and today is here with our partners through the Treatment and Services Adaptation Center for Resiliency, Hope and Wellness in Schools. This is part of a long-term series, and I'll get to that in a second, but I just want to go over a couple things in case you're joining us and you want to get settled. I want to just say thank you to SAMHSA for funding us. As you know, this is the Pacific Southwest and Northwest, and we're funded by SAMHSA, and all opinions and views expressed are those of ourselves and Dr. Salim only. And we appreciate that. So this is going to be recorded and posted on our website. Livia will put the link of where you can find all the recordings posted. And if you don't see today's, it doesn't mean that we're not getting it up. It means we're just working on it. So we'll get it up to you as soon as possible. I want to offer a moment of land acknowledgement. We heard yesterday from a couple speakers of our nation acknowledge the land that we either come from or occupy. And so before and especially as we're engaging in a conversation about how to talk about race and addressing and affirming, we want to start with an acknowledgement. So I'm going to offer you a moment to put in the chat box if you don't come from the land of the University of Washington Smart Center, if you don't come from the lands of the Coast Salish and Native peoples, and if you don't come from the land of the Nisenan and the Cahuilla Band and the Tongva peoples. So if you don't come from either the Washington area or the California area, if you might put the native land that you know that you are living on or that you occupy, so we can all acknowledge what we are working through, working with, and working towards. Thank you. Thank you. This is all good peer education too, because I'm learning. Hey, Chumash. I'm learning, and we're all learning from the lands that you put in for the chat. So part of this work around us supporting schools and supporting systems is knowing that we are here together to support and continue. I see you. Thank you, Yakima Nation. We're here to support and continue schools to be rehumanized and to feel rehumanized. And that also means rehumanizing ourselves. And a part of the constant rehumanization is a moment of humility to know that the apartments we sit in, the houses we work from, the lands and right now the places that we're sheltered in place are sitting and holding larger stories that involve us and some that don't involve us. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for putting where you are occupying and where you are coming from for those who identify as Native and Indigenous. Speaking of land, this is the last main session of our series. The last main session of our series on ISF, Interconnected Systems Framework, with Dr. Farsana Salim. And we are incredibly grateful to have collaborated with the Northwest MHTTC and the Pacific Southwest MHTTC. So the Northwest serves the lands of Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. See a lot of you in the chat box. We at the Pacific Southwest Center support the people and the school mental health workforce of the Pacific Islands, Hawaii, California, Nevada, and Arizona. And we, of course, are part of a larger network. So even if you're not part of our network, even if you are not part of our network, we definitely encourage you to join us and to learn from each other, and we'll join your regional learnings as well. We are funded to support the school mental health workforce in your awareness and in your competencies and your skills to do the work that you're charged to do, and then to expand the work that we're asked to do. So again, sometimes we're given a role, but we know that we have a larger vision for the work. We want to do that together. Thank you for those of you who took the time to research where you live and where you're coming from. So speaking of this series, many of you know that this entire body of work came from 3 fact sheets that we collaborated with Susan Barrett, who many of you have been learning with, and Lucille Eber and Kelly Prowlis and Katie Pullman and many other folks who created fact sheets. And then we created foundational webinars that are linked below. And then we realized, you know what, we need to do more work. So we created this entire series. I just want to see really quickly, I think I have time for this. Yes, I do. Really quickly, if you have been to one session in all the modules, so you've been to a session in module 1, in module 2, module 3, and now module 4, if you could put an asterisk in the chat box. So if you have been to at least one session in all the modules, okay, put an asterisk in the chat box. Nice, y'all. Nice. Amazing. If you have been to at least like 2 modules, put a hashtag. So you may have gone to something in the trauma-informed approaches, and maybe you're here now for equity, hashtag. Okay. Awesome. Okay, so you're putting an asterisk if you've been to 1 in all 4, and a hashtag if you've been to 2. And I've got 2 more questions. Okay, if you can put an exclamation point if you've been to every single session, including this one, exclamation point. So from the 20th with Susan Barrett to Steve. Okay, Alexis, yes. So you've been to Susan's sessions, you've been to Steve, you were with Pamela, you were with Beth, you were with Vivian. You're gonna put an exclamation point. Okay, rock stars, amazing. Woo, that's some dedicated learning. And then last, I'm gonna offer you to put a @ symbol if this is your first session with us. An @ symbol if this is your first session. Okay, cool. We are so grateful. Welcome. Okay. Woo, those 2 who've been to all of them, I'm telling you, I got some props for you. That is amazing. So like I said, we're at our very, very final session of our modules. This is our module on the interconnected systems framework and equity. Again, if this is your first time with us, welcome. And if this is your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, whatever, if this is your 1,000,000th time with us, also welcome. Livia put the link to all the recordings, so you can go back in time and learn with your colleagues. For sure, at the end, we'll see, if you've got any if your peers have recommendations of highlight sessions and who should go back to what. Okay, so today we're focusing on the interconnection between the interconnected systems framework and equity, right? And on racial violence. So I just wanted to take a quick moment. All of us, just like we did a land acknowledgement, I want to do a racism acknowledgement. All of us come from completely individualized and sometimes collective feelings, experiences, and needs when it comes to conversations about race and racism and structural violence and structural healing for ourselves and for our young people. So some of you can teach critical race theory. Some of you're just entering some learning around the role that racism has played in our schools and in school communities and school systems. So there's a whole continuum. Regardless of where you are, anytime that we're talking about conversations in which our cultures don't have a lot of skill with, which is still racism, we're still growing in that space, it can heighten, right? Anytime we're talking about hurt with anyone, it can heighten. And anytime we're talking about healing or addressing and affirming, it can get us maybe outside of our bodies sometimes. I'm just going to offer you your own way to do some observation during this session, not absorption, just observation. So just to think about, how do I need to be safe right now? Again, you're all off camera, you're all off video, so we're learning kind of in our own space. So safety might mean you're doodling during this, it might mean you're stretching during it, it might mean you're really here during it. We're offering you to think about how you can be and stay present. And I'm noting that there is so much happening in the world right now, and all of you are incredible educators and professionals charged with so much, but you're choosing to be here right now. So what can you do in this moment to stay here And Farzana is a skilled teacher, and so she'll be leading you through. Just make sure to hydrate. I've got water next to me. And just to do a body check, like, ooh, I'm realizing I'm clenching my jaw right now, or I'm feeling teary, or I'm feeling excited. And the last is just to respect your body. So our bodies, as Bessel van der Kolk says, keep the score. And anytime that we're engaged in learning that pushes or stretches us or affirms us, our body holds that story. So even during the session or after the session, what are you going to need in order to take care of yourself and those around you? Okay. Last thing, then Farzana, I'm going to cue you to come on, but just last thing. So if you are new to this conversation, the whole reason that we're talking about equity is because it is at the center of practices, data, and systems to meet those student and school outcomes. We can't do any of this work without talking about equity, which speaks to not everyone having the same thing, but us designing systems that address historical disenfranchisement, structural need, and ensuring that our young people and those that serve them get the services that reflect the need that they're holding and also interrupt patterns that have created that need. Both and. Both and. So we're thinking about practices in equity, and many of you are so skilled in cultivating school systems. And the conversation today is, we're actually going to not only say equity as like a ubiquitous, sometimes general term that we use, we're actually going to name racism and its connection to the equity work. Okay. That said, my friends and colleagues, I'm so incredibly excited to welcome Dr. Salim to the conversation, who will be leading us in learning. And I'm going to come on at the end, and we'll be able to do some learning and some discussion. But I'm going to hand it over to you, Dr. Salim, to introduce yourself. And I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen so you can pull up yours as you're doing the introduction. So colleagues, as we're transitioning the screens, I welcome you to just do a little shoulder rub, little shoulder roll.
Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be here with you today and to be presenting. I'm in the process of sharing my screen with you, so just give me a couple of seconds as I navigate over to that. All right, wonderful. I'm very excited to be here with you all today. I'm currently assistant professor in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University, and I will be introducing myself a bit more in a couple of slides, but I just wanted to kind of start us off with activity to get us engaged. So today, as Leora mentioned, I'll be talking about the presentation title is Understanding Racial Stress and Trauma in Schools and Responding by Addressing and Affirming Race. So in terms of the beginning activity for us, I would like you all to take a couple of minutes, go to menti.com, so MENTI.com, and use the code 9321095. And I want you just to type in a few ways that that you think that children or adolescents learn about race. And so this is also, it can be how you learned about race too, right? Because all of us were children at one point. So I want you to just take a few minutes to do that. And then we'll transition to our presentation, and we'll come back to those results in just a bit. So I'll give you all a few seconds to do that. All right, so we're going to continue on just for the sake of time, and you can feel free if you're still typing in to continue to do that. Before we jump in, again, I too want to just acknowledge where we are currently in our climate. There has been, there's a history, right, of racial tension, violence, injustice within our country. And in particular, I think over the last year, there's been increased racial tension, I would say, within our country related to multiple things, right? So whether it's the number of folks that now their deaths are being more kind of televised and media attention has been given to the loss of a lot of Black folks within the United States due to situations that are connected to race and racism. I think that that has definitely brought up a lot of pain and difficult conversations and reflections about our country and our racial climate. I think some folks are still contending with the incidents and, as many would call, the insurrection at the Capitol last week, which again has a lot of racial connections to that. And so I just want to acknowledge the lives lost in that, and also the fact that talking about race and talking about the systems and kind of historical events that have led to these situations and constantly, I think, are still very relevant or on the minds of folks. I just want to take a second to acknowledge that and recognize that this might be a difficult time for some, whether it's dealing with the pain from those situations or trying to come to an understanding of these situations and trying to find your kind of role in kind of your role in the process and understanding and potentially healing. Okay, so let's jump in. So just a bit about me. I am trained as a clinical community psychologist. And like I said, I'm an assistant professor at Stanford in the Graduate School of Education. A lot of my research is really focused on how do we reduce the negative mental health consequences of race-related stressors for youth of color, with a focus on African-American youth and a big focus on racial socialization within families and schools. And so that's thinking about how do we teach youth about race? How do we prepare them for managing racial bias and discrimination? And how can we help them have pride in their ethnic racial group? In addition to research, I am also trained as a therapist. So my clinical focus is really on helping youth manage trauma. A part of that work for me too is helping adolescents manage identity concerns and also manage racial stress. So you will see throughout the presentation that is pretty embedded as we go out. So in terms of our objectives today, pieces of that will be really thinking a lot about developing our understanding of racial stress and trauma, and thinking about how it manifests across different levels of the school ecology, which we'll talk about that in a minute. Another objective is to learn skills to discuss race and racial stress and trauma in schools, and again, across the school ecology. And then an additional objective is to think about tools that can be applied in schools and within the systems that you work with that can promote resilience, empowerment, and healing from these experiences of racial stress and racial trauma. All right. So this is just a quick roadmap of where we're going to go in terms of topics of starting with racial stress and trauma, talking some about ethnic racial socialization, and then diving into some resources, tools, and a part of that will be reflection and some Q&A at the end. So let's start with some poll questions, because we are now in this virtual world, and I think that it's sometimes hard to get a sense of the audience, right? So I can't see your faces. I would love to know who is in the room. So I'm going to ask, I think, Leora, if you could pull up our first set of poll questions. These questions are just to help me get an understanding, again, of who's in the room, and then it might even help me be able to tailor some of the content based on who's in the room. So I'm going to give you all a few minutes to answer these first couple of questions on here. So the first question is, what's your primary occupational role? And then the second one is, do you view your job as having an impact on students? So I'll give you all a few minutes here to answer these questions, and then we'll go on to a couple of more.
All right, so Farzan, I'm going to publish now.
Okay. All right, great. So we see that we have a mixture of folks here with a lot of people endorsing others. So there's a variety of people who have different kind of occupational roles related to schools. And then when we talk about the second question is, do you view your job as having an impact on students? It looks like the majority of folks have said yes, directly. I think my work does. And the other next kind of most frequently endorsed answer was indirectly. And then some people said somewhat, because I work with school staff who then work with students. So it sounds like everyone is saying in some way, shape, or form, which makes sense for the context of this webinar, what you do does have either a trickle down effect or a direct effect on students. So let's go to the next poll. All right, so these two questions are, how much knowledge do you have about racial stress and trauma? And then the other one is, how comfortable do you feel addressing topics of race within your workplace? So we will give you all a few minutes to answer these. All right, it looks like most people have had a chance to vote. So let's publish this. All right, so it looks like about 15% of folks are saying they have a lot of knowledge about racial stress and trauma, which is wonderful. We also have some people who say a moderate amount, so that's 62%, which is great. And then we also have some people who say a little bit to no knowledge, which is completely fine. Our goal is to help everyone be able to have more knowledge at the end of this presentation. And when we talk about comfort addressing topics of race within the workplace, it looks like the majority of people are saying, I feel somewhat comfortable having this conversation. 29% are saying very comfortable. And then a few people are saying not at all comfortable. So that's very helpful for me to know as I'm going through. So I think we have one more question we'll have you all answer. And it's, what do you hope to get from the webinar today? So I'll give you all a few seconds to answer that. All right, it looks like most people have voted. So we can display those results, and we see that there is a lot of people who are saying that it would be helpful to have strategies and resources thinking about school-wide or district level change. There are also some folks who are saying just some foundational general knowledge, as well as resources that can be used with students and staff, and then a couple of people who are saying skills that they can use for their own self-reflection. So that is really helpful for me to know. And I think we will exit out here. So it looks, the poll should be cleared from your screens at this point. So we will jump right in. Thank you all for answering those questions. So when we think about the school climate, I wanted to just ground us here at the beginning of the presentation. Often I talk about this as the school ecology. So when we think about the different ways surrounded by students that we have an impact on schools, I think about the direct kind of middle. Everything is surrounded around students, right? So they're our inner circle. And then next we have staff within the school system. So that might be principals, that might be teachers, that might be school counselors. And then I see this other kind of larger circle as folks within the system, right? So they might be leadership people at the district level, and also just kind of systems that are creating things like policies or practices that impact individual schools. And so I understand that from the polls, you all are in different levels of the school ecology, which is, again, helpful to ground our conversation today. So some of the content, I want you to think about how your, the different level of the school ecology that you're in, how the content is applying to you. And we'll have some chance to sit and reflect on that a bit towards the end of the presentation. But I wanted to start us off and ground us there with that context. So when we think about the school climate, I think one part of the school climate that's very important is the racial climate. I think quite a bit about that. And a part of the racial climate does have to do with experiences of racial discrimination, right? So that's one piece of many parts that make up the racial climate in the school. And so when we think about racial discrimination, again, I like to ground us in definitions here. So when we talk about it, we're saying that this is basically any act of an individual or institution that denies equitable treatment to an individual or group because of skin tone or phenotypical characteristics, right? And so then the other important thing to think about is just kind of the high prevalence of racial discrimination, right? So when we're trying to understand, well, why is this important? Well, we know that more than 2/3 of African American and Latinx youth report exposure to racial discrimination. And I think I do want to say that the presentation today, I think can be applied across schools and systems, but it really has a focus on youth of color, and in particular, African American and Latinx youth. So we know that these experiences can be common for youth. And in fact, there was a recent study that showed that some adolescents reported within this study, on average, most adolescents reported that they had about 5 encounters with racial discrimination per day. So this was a daily diary study, which is really helping us better understand the frequency with which youth are having experiences with race-related stressors. And so I'm just imagining, and you can imagine, what that might be like to have on average about 5 experiences that are race related in terms of discrimination per day. And we know that this is important because some youth are able to identify race as early as preschool, right? Perceptions are often sharpened beginning this period of adolescence, but youth can recognize racial differences as early as children, as toddlers, right, or babies. There are some studies that look at eye tracking differences that show that youth can, based on eye tracking, we see that there is a difference in how long they're looking at certain faces. So it is early kind of socialized within us and inherent within us to notice differences, and that continues to grow, right, as youth get older. So when we talk about racial discrimination too, I think it's really helpful to think about what concretely do we mean, right? So experiences can differ beyond these individual encounters. I think oftentimes people think about, something like a burning cross, right? Or if we think back about black and white only signs, or these individual encounters that are very at the interpersonal level. But I want us to also think beyond that when we're thinking about what types of race-related experiences might be happening, both to students directly, but then also, again, within your level of the school ecology that you are within. And again, thinking about how that might trickle down to students. So some other examples are these microaggressions, right? So these are small, subtle things that are related to race. We also have, again, more interpersonal things beyond just verbal exchanges, right? So there could be things like bullying. There could be some teasing related to race. There's also these vicarious experiences. So that's an example of this might be the viewing of unarmed, the viewing of unarmed Black and brown children, right? That are being killed or harassed, in person, on television, on the internet. So seeing that, not necessarily directly experiencing it, is also a form of racial stress. So these are experiences that go beyond these general kind of racial discrimination encounters that we think about, and they can also just be kind of racially stressful situations that a person can experience. And then this last bullet here is just thinking about the fact that experiences can also be at the institutional level as well. So thinking about policies and practices that are set up that might perpetuate racial discrimination. So often people think about this as racialized stress, right? So you have a discrimination encounter. Oftentimes it might lead to some sort of stress. It doesn't always have to. And for some people, there might be certain situations that do not, but often there might be some sort of stress for folks who are experiencing racial discrimination or other encounters related to race. It can also be traumatic, right, for some individuals. So there can be a situation that can be racially traumatic. And what do we mean by that? So, we're referring to kind of symptoms of emotional and psychological pain that can occur during or after racial discrimination. We talked about earlier the frequency of racial discrimination happening, and this is just to kind of acknowledge that encounters with racial discrimination can become over time traumatic. And so when we think about trauma, oftentimes people think about post-traumatic stress disorder. And encounters with racial discrimination can be a discrete event that was racially traumatic and could qualify as PTSD, or it could just be stressful encounters that are having negative psychological, physiological, and negative academic, related to negative academic outcomes for youth. So again, it could be these incidents that over time accumulate to be very stressful or traumatic. It can be a single racial incident that was traumatic, right? So if we think about witnessing a racially motivated killing within your community, right? And there's a lot of racial dialogue and discussion around that. We might think about something like George Floyd. That is a single racially traumatic incident. And then we can also have these racialized experiences that in themselves are just somewhat stressful. Again, regardless of whether the racial stressor is traumatic or not, we know that these experiences are still linked to negative outcomes. And again, it's challenging because I think across settings, the influence of racism and racialized stress and trauma is often overlooked or misunderstood when we think about how it might be impacting youth outcomes. And so from there, I just want to take us to a video thinking about real conversations and real stories from some individuals thinking about both how they experience race-related stress and then also how they learn about race and discuss race. So first, I'm going to show you a video by the New York Times where they interviewed several Black boys talking about what it's like to grow up Black. And so give me 1 second. I'm going to pull up my Google Chrome here to share this with you.
In class, sometimes I'd be the only Black kid, and we read a book like, I don't know, Huck Finn, and then there's that uncomfortable moment, the magic word would come up, and people would look at you and like, what's his reaction, and things like that.
I was walking home from school with this one white girl, and we just got off the bus, and we were almost home, and there were these group of Black kids that just got out of school, and she was like, oh, let's cross the street, there's a group of Black kids, I don't want to run into them. And so she told me, which I don't even know why she would do that.
I used to wear a sweatband, like, just to reinforce my wrist. And I had a teacher come up to me and say, you should take it off because it looks gang affiliated.
I've been in situations where, I had to cross the street because I didn't want to scare the white lady that was walking.
It would get to the point where I would start to count how many times a woman would clutch her bag.
When I was 16, I was leaving my mom's house in my pajamas, which had snowmen on them, with my brother, and we were actually stopped by the police rather aggressively.
I've been stopped by the cops on my way between classes because we have two separate buildings, walking from one building to the other building, as my white students in the same class walk by me.
It's kind of upsetting because we live in a world where my mom has to be afraid when I walk outside from the people that are like meant to protect me. And I don't like when my mother feels like that. I love my mother. I want her to always be happy.
I walk tall, I keep my head up, very, try to be very articulate and polite. And so, of course, I was like, okay, I'm going to be fine because I act a certain way. And of course, that has absolutely nothing to do with it. The way people perceive you, is not up to you.
My parents taught me, cops are your friends. You're supposed to, they're here to protect you. But all I'm seeing is the opposite. So how can I not be afraid when I feel like I'm being hunted?
Okay, so I'm gonna pause us there really quick. I'm gonna switch to another video. And as I'm switching to this next video, I just want you to keep in mind and in context, again, in your level of your school ecology, how race is talked about, how discrimination is experienced, and then also given that all of you said that in some way the work that you do influences students, I want you to think about their experiences, and again, how the work that you might be doing might influence the way that they experience or manage race-related stress in school in some way, shape, or form. So give me 1 second as I pull up the next video. And I do want to give a quick heads up about, and if there's a little bit of offensive language in this, so I just want to prepare you mentally for that.
Ut in Puerto Rico.
I thought my name was Spick until I was about 13. And that was my first awareness that race was an issue.
People say, oh, you look like a white dude. In some contexts, not in all contexts, depends where I am, depends who I'm with, depends whole lot of things. Depends what language I'm speaking. But however I look, when I leave my name, I can't get a phone call back about an apartment in New York City. And this isn't like 10 places I call, this is like 30.
And I remember telling a kid one time, I was like, let me tell you, the Ku Klux Klan comes here and they see your last name, you're going too, bro. You know, and the kids are like, what are you talking about? And it was like a big thing.
People generally, you know, unless I speak Spanish, you know, people assume right away, I mean, that I'm African-American, that I'm Black. You know, I mean, it's, you know, just one of those things. It may be the deep voice, it may be the color of my skin.
Because I talk white, I'm not Dominican, I'm not Black, or I'm not Afro-Latina, or whoever people perceive me as of being. And that hurt, and that still hurts.
Because one of my daughters is lighter than the other, they had Blackness issues. And I remember my oldest daughter telling my youngest daughter that she was Black and her hair, she said something. And I remember crying like immediately, like, oh my God. No. And I had to sit them down and talk to them about our roots and that everything that they learned from the family was wrong.
I feel like I wanted more.
Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to stop us there. And I want to have us think a bit about, you know, what we just saw. So if we can have folks really quickly in the chat, just chime in about different things that that they saw or noticed within those videos, that would be great. And maybe, Leora, if you could just read some of those responses that are coming in from the chat out loud, that would be very helpful.
Got it. Yeah. So again, the question is, what did you notice, right? Not how you are feeling necessarily or your reaction, but what did you notice? Okay, so we have intersectionality, noticed pain, hurt in the voices. Yeah, so hearing hurt in voices, anger, hurt, pain, and anger, elevation of anxiety and anger, the soul is sacred, some shame, pain, veiled in giggles and laughter, shame and anxiety, fear and rejection, pain and fear. So we're seeing a lot of themes coming up. Judgment.
Excellent. And thank you all for sharing that. I think that's really helpful. And to move us to applying this a bit, I'm curious to hear from you all, you know, have people within, again, your level of the school ecology, when you saw that image, express stress or concern about any of these topics here, right? So related to ethnicity or race, related to racial discrimination, related to identity concerns. So some of these things that were reflected in the folks that you heard talking about these topics on the previous video. So if you could just type a few responses in the chat boxes, I'm curious to hear a little bit about what you all, what you all have to say about this. And Leora, if you could just read some of the comments in the chat boxes, that would be great.
Yes, the reminder is that the levels of the school ecology, the nest, right, is the system, a school, or working with students directly. So within your level, and I know many of you work with multiple levels, just choose one. Choose one. Like how does your district or your county, what have you heard expressed or concerned? And why or why not have you heard that expression?
And if folks are struggling to think about this, I think you feel free to write in the comment box, I don't think so, or I haven't heard anything. And then if you have thoughts about maybe why you might not have heard anything, we're happy to think of some about that too. And I'm just curious too to see what the group is thinking about with this.
Yeah. Yes. So there's a yes. I've heard folks talk about ethnicity, race, racial discrimination, and colorism. And yes, directly racial discrimination or prejudice, racial stress or trauma. And then we've got folks who say, no, I haven't heard enough expressed. And the majority of folks I work with are white, which is why I'm concerned. Like that's my why, right? And there's another person who connects to that. Nope, haven't heard it from white folks, white people, the vast majority, and even when directly addressed. And that's why there might be silencing from students who identify as Black. And have not heard anything but behavior has been racial, and maybe we can even say racialized, right? So that there's maybe some coded directly or indirectly around talking about behavior. Yeah, and actually, you know, forgive me, Dr. Salim, if it's okay for me to add, but one of the most important chapters, I think, in How to Be an Anti-Racist is Ibram Kendi's chapter on behavior, that specific chapter, yeah. Okay, so we've got a couple more, yes, conversations around racial stress and trauma. We've got some folks who have personal experiences with being told to go, quote unquote, go back to an origin country, and then some silence.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for reading those out. That's helpful, again, to contextualize our experiences and then think about, you know, if we haven't heard these concerns, why might that be? And I think it's helpful to hear that part too. So is it because, you know, the makeup or the demographic of the workplace? Is it that people don't feel like they can talk about it? Is that people don't know how to talk about it, right? And then again, thinking about how that might trickle down to impact students in schools as well, I think is really important for us. I'll move us on to think some about this experience of how racialized stressors and or trauma can manifest psychologically for youth. We talked about, you know, it can manifest with these psychological outcomes or mental health symptoms. It can be physiological, it can be academic, and those are all really important and relevant. And this model my colleagues and I developed, it's called the Developmental Ecological Model of Youth Racial Trauma. And it's just a simple depiction, right? Because I think sometimes people say, these concepts are really broad, like how can it with something concrete? So what we talk about in this particular model is just that, you know, all of us carry, you know, generational epigenetics, right? When we think about epigenetics and kind of intergenerational trauma and stress and the things that are passed down to us from future generations, experiences with racial trauma, whether that's genocide, slavery, right? A lot of that is encoded in our DNA biologically. That's kind of passed down, right? And then when we think about racial incidents and how they lead to these outcomes for youth, we can think about a child experiencing a single or multiple events that are related to race-related stress, and that they can cause these individual traumatic reactions, or again, these other outcomes we talked about too, like negative outcomes in terms of academics, or some of these physiological symptoms, which is noted here. So these boxes at the bottom are just different forms of common reactions with folks who experience PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so we're just depicting based on empirical studies and conceptual and theoretical frameworks about how this happens to impact the psychological health of youth. And then on the sides of this model, I know it's a little bit busy. We have family context and we have community processes, which is where schools are embedded within. And so I think a lot about how the family system in the community context, including schools, can really influence the way youth manage and respond and cope with racial stress. So I think that the school context has a big role in supporting youth and sometimes perpetuating race-related stress, discrimination, and bias. But I also see the school as such an important place for potential healing and intervention. And the last thing I'll say about this is that we do consider within this model the differences across development, right? So experiences with race-related stress, the way it manifests, that will look really different depending on if we're talking about elementary school, middle school, or even high school. So I want to go back to our poll results as we're reflecting a lot about you know, how race comes up. We're talking about discrimination. I just wanted to see what you all, some things you all thought about in terms of how youth learn about race. And so for some reason my cursor is acting up, but I'm going to take us back to Google Chrome really quick and see what you all said about this. All right. So we had a lot of folks put in some different things. The way this works is that the bigger images that you see on the screen are things that multiple people said in terms of how you've learned about race. So the things that really are standing out to me right now, a lot of people said that family, media, schools, friends, parents, community, individualized experiences are really big ones. So that it looks like a lot of people endorsed those the most. Then we see some smaller words on here, but I think also really great ones. All of these are great. And some of them overlap. So people saying, one small example that's standing out to me is observing interactions, right? That's a really good one. So it doesn't have to be something that's direct. It can be indirect, right? So you can be standing by and observing something and you're learning about race through that dynamic. Culture is another great example. So all really wonderful examples that I think kind of helps contextualize a little bit for us as we're thinking about how youth are learning about experiences related to race. So you should be able to see the PowerPoint again. And again, I appreciate your participation in that. And I want to move us to think about the socialization process, right? So when we talk about how you learn about race, that is ethnic racial socialization. We know that actually is a protective factor against race-related stressors for youth of color. And so when I say ethnic racial socialization, this is the messages and behaviors that are transmitted to youth about race, culture, heritage, managing discrimination. This can be really different across groups, right? So for folks of color, a lot of this might be related to understanding the social position that you're in within the world based on race. It might be about how do you interact with the police. For other groups like white folks, I think that it's often about, how can you intervene? How can you support? How can you stand kind of in solidarity or help your children learn anti-racist views and also appreciation of other cultures. So this could be, is often thought about as a different process for those who are white and those who are folks of color. There are also differences across groups, but what I'll talk about quickly is the main types of racial socialization messages that come up. So when we talk about specifically, this page is thinking a lot about for communities of color and families of color and youth of color. One common message is cultural pride messages. So these are messages teaching youth to feel good about their heritage, learn their history, and feel and have a strong kind of sense of pride and connection to that, right? So below that, I have a verbal message, right? So it could be a mother saying to her child, you should be proud to be Black. What we know about these messages are that for youth of color, that these messages are associated with positive outcomes, including positive mental health outcomes, academic outcomes for youth. The next message is preparation for bias messages. Again, for youth of color, this is messages like you have to work twice as hard as whites to get ahead in the world. So that might be a message that a family member or a teacher conveys to a child. And we know that these messages are helpful for youth, and sometimes they're associated with negative outcomes. The caveat here is that these messages have to, they're best given in the context of messages about pride, right? So preparing kids for the reality that they might experience racial discrimination while also pairing that with messages about understanding their history, their group, and having pride. Another message is promotion of mistrust messages. So these are messages that teach youth not to trust other groups. So again, a verbal message might be, keep your distance from kids and adults who don't look like you. These messages generally aren't associated with good outcomes for youth. And another message is colorblind messages. So these are messages that are conveying that race doesn't matter, or messages that focus more on individual qualities. We also know that these messages are not associated with positive outcomes for youth generally either. There's also messages that include silence about race, which I'll get to in a minute, but I just wanted to show a couple of other images, right? So when we're thinking about socialization, there's so many ways it can happen. It can happen through verbal discussions. It can happen through actions like buying your child a doll or toys or books that reflect their own ethnic racial group. And it can also be, just like someone mentioned in the word cloud example, it can be overhearing conversations, right? So it doesn't have to be a verbal, it doesn't have to be a verbal thing. It can also be images that are displayed around you. These are some other kind of forms of racial socialization that might be more common among white families and white youth. So one is cultural appreciation. So learning about other groups and teaching kind of the value of different groups. And we know that these are associated with positive adjustment and interaction among youth. And then we have some, under each of these, I have some examples. I won't read them all out loud, but they're kind of examples, verbal examples of how these messages could be conveyed. The next type of message is kind of these anti-racist socialization messages. So the messages that are having a youth learn about racial inequality, inequity, and then thinking about ways to kind of dismantle, address, or kind of be an ally or stand in solidarity with groups that have been historically racially disenfranchised. And we know that these messages generally are healthy and associated with positive intergroup interactions. And then just like on the other slide, there are promotion of mistrust messages that again are teaching youth not to trust folks from other groups. And there are these colorblind messages that are de-emphasizing race. Again, we know that both of these messages are not associated with the best outcomes and tend to not be helpful when we're thinking about cross-group interactions and forming healthy relationships, and then thinking about building a racial climate that is healthy. The other thing that I didn't necessarily put on here, but it's another form of socialization, is silence about race, right? So choosing not to discuss race is another kind of form of socialization that might come up as well. So I want to get us into schools as a context. So why schools? So you all are involved in some way, shape, or form with students in schools, depending on your level in the school ecology. So we know that early on, the family context is a really important context for how you learn about race, right? How you manage race-related stressors. But as youth get older, schools become generally the next context that's really salient for how youth understand, manage, process, and encounter race, race in different forms. And so we know that youth spend a lot of time in school and that they can receive racial socialization messages in a number of ways. We also know that they can experience racial discrimination, right? So from teachers, peers, there might even be system level things that they experience. And so I want to spend some time talking a bit about this racial socialization transmission model, which I think will be applicable depending, to all folks, including those, at the direct level with youth. So it might be teachers and school counselors that are in that first kind of school ecology bubble. And I think it's also relevant to those of you who are in that larger kind of system, who might, again, be kind of that district leadership, might be people training folks who are going to be going into the schools, because I think we want to be thinking at all levels when we're discussing how race is discussed, how race-related stress and trauma are managed, and how we can help heal. So as we walk through this model, we'll have some reflection moments where I'll take intentional pauses and have you all reflect. So what I'll walk you through right now is just having us think about, okay, who are the transmitters of messages about race in schools? And so this is kind of the first part of the model, and that has us think about on the ground, there are, peers, there are other students, there are teachers and staff, but then there are also these trickle down effects from policies, from practices. And I think we also have to make sure we're acknowledging kind of the historical and community context in this process, and as well as other socializers that are involved within the process, right? So what youth are coming in with, how their parents are talking to them about race, or how folks in their after school activities are talking about race, that also has an influence. And so when we're thinking about this, the transmitter piece. It's really individuals or institutional agents that are conveying these implicit or explicit messages about the meaning and significance of race, right? Or how to manage discrimination. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but this just gives you some quick examples. So when we think about teachers and staff, these are different ways that can happen, right? Peers, this is another way that these messages are conveyed, as well as, again, those institutional practices and policies. So I've been talking a lot, and I want to take an intentional moment to kind of pause and let you all process for a second, particularly as it relates to thinking about these transmitters, right? So who are the transmitters of racial socialization in your level of school ecology? And I also want you to think a little bit about, based on that, do you think that those folks are sending similar or different messages about race? So, and then I'll ask Leora if you could let me know if people are typing in different things in the chat, and maybe we could just read out a few things that come up.
Yeah, I think it might be helpful as folks are putting, so first of all, there's been a lot to process. So I encourage you to take a breath. I'm going to go on video so that folks can see, and then I'll go off video again.
Okay.
And also just wanted to name, maybe Farsana, we can do an example while folks are thinking about it. So when you think about a transmitter of ERS in your level of the school ecology, so again, that's the question is what are examples of how district, county, your program, or your department is either silencing or messaging any of the factors that Dr. Salim presented that might contribute to race-based stress or racism-based stress. Is that a good reframe, Dr. Salim? Okay.
Perfect. That's perfect. And it can also be, in addition to that too, it could also be some of the positive things, right? Are there ways that you all are promoting pride, right? Cultural appreciation. So you can just name which piece you notice or things that stand out to you as you're reflecting, whether that's the perpetuation of race-related stress or things that are promoting kind of cultural appreciation and pride.
Yeah, so some of the transmitters, the actors, we've got someone who said district and site administrators. So they encourage or avoid conversations about race among staff, that there's a acknowledgement that culturally relevant teaching is important, but systemic racism might cross that threshold of comfort. And even that is a message.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you for those of you who are contributing. And then a couple more. So we've got some Catholic schools in my community have policies that relate to the length of hair and hairstyles that are primarily discriminatory, especially related to ethnic hairstyles. And we might say hairstyles of students of color or folks of culture.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's great. Thank you again for those who are participating. I just want to be mindful of time here, and we have a couple more reflection questions. So I think we can continue on, but this is great because like we were saying, whether it's the silence about race, whether it's thinking about how curriculum is chosen, how training is done, right? All of these things related to race and helping youth manage racial stress and the resilience piece, which is how do we help instill kind of the cultural appreciation, the cultural pride. A lot of that is playing out at these multiple levels of the school ecology that you all are embedded within. So next, I'll move us on to the middle of this model, which has a couple of different things, right? So you'll notice that it has within the school level view of racial socialization, the core messages that we talked about earlier, a lot of those are reflected when we think about what type of racial socialization is happening at the school level. But we have slightly different names for these things. It really is not that big of a deal in terms of the naming of it. It kind of just depends on what scholar kind of wrote the measures and how they named it. But I'll make the connections for you. And then beyond like the content, which is what messages are being translated, we also have the modes of how these things are happening. So, is it verbal? Is it nonverbal? Is it images? So we'll talk some about that right now. Okay, so we're talking again about those transmitters. What types of messages are they transmitting, right? So previously we talked about cultural pride or cultural socialization messages. So in schools, that's the same thing. So are youth learning about or getting messages about the importance of their own culture, and particularly for communities of color or youth from BIPOC youth, so Black, Indigenous, or other folks of color, having pride in your culture. And we know that that's particularly important for them, given, again, the historical and institutional level discrimination, as well as interpersonal discrimination that has taught youth of color maybe to not be prideful, right? So we know that that's why this is important. So this is just an example of what that might mean. So at schools, how do children or adolescents have a chance to learn about the history or traditions of their culture? The next message in school is this cultural competence piece, right? So are youth getting a chance to learn about other cultures, right? And that's an important piece related to that cultural appreciation of other groups. So that's another common message when we're translating it more from that family context, or those general messages that might happen early on, to this school context. The next one in schools that's very common is critical consciousness messages, right? So these are messages similar to those messages preparing kids for discrimination and letting them know that it exists. It is instead, these messages are focused a bit more on helping youth learn about prejudice and discrimination, and generally how they can, if there are ways that they can act to address that, right, or advocate for change. So that's generally paired with that piece as well. So a very concrete example is, our classes teaching about how race and ethnicity might play a role in who is successful? And again, are there opportunities to think about advocacy or social change as it relates to these things? And then colorblind messages, which I realize I'm talking a lot here, so we'll be pausing in just a bit. You might remember those from our previous slide. Again, those can be transmitted very commonly in school too. So teaching you to ignore the role of race in their lives or in society. So that would be schools that are encouraging, or even if it's not intentional, it might be indirectly encouraging the kind of silence about race, right? Or ignoring these racial and ethnic differences. And then finally, these mainstream messages can also be common in schools. So teaching youth that about kind of US values and norms, including the need to assimilate. So that it's generally thinking more about kind of the focus on the US, and just thinking about kind of the current culture and values and norms within a more like westernized view, for example. So those are kind of the different common ways that these messages are really discussed within schools. And similar to what we've been talking about all along, I think that it's really important for us to think about the many ways that you've learned about race and discuss racial discrimination, right? So again, it can be these verbal messages, or it can be these nonverbal messages. So in specific to the school context, right now, if we're thinking about an example within that kind of bubble of the school ecology, is there a bulletin board showing information about a foreign country or culture, right? Or acknowledging a specific holiday. So that's a nonverbal example. And there's tons of those that, in terms of ways that race can be communicated. I like to also just acknowledge our intent within this. So sometimes it can be passive or unintentional conversations, right? So maybe deciding, again, within that first bubble of the school ecology, it might be a teacher deciding not to address racial bullying. Then we also can have kind of these proactive ways, intentional and unprompted opportunities to discuss race, or try to understand how youth are feeling or experiencing encounters with race-related stress in school, right? It can also be, again, a teacher maybe choosing to integrate a course content that reflects specific groups or diverse groups. And then the other way is kind of reactive ways. So maybe someone being prompted to talk about race or discrimination based on what's happening in the media or in society or in the news. So there's not, I'm not communicating this to say that there's one right or wrong way in terms of intent, but I think thinking through, the ways that you might be communicating, what prompts you to communicate, or what might get in the way of you choosing not to communicate within your level of school ecology, I think is really important. And obviously thinking about how that might trickle down to the schools or folks that you're training, and ultimately to students when it comes to conversations about race. Okay, and then this last piece is just us recognizing that these things ultimately influence outcomes for our students. And I want to believe that most of us working within these contexts really care about promoting the health and well-being and resilience of students. And so we want to be thoughtful about this. And so to bring us to another kind of pause, I know that was a lot of information. I want us to think some about, what types of messages are transmitted and how in your level of school ecology. And then again, how might this filter down to students in schools in terms of how they're communicating about race, and if they're feeling comfortable discussing things like racial discrimination or racial stressors that might be coming up in schools. And so I'll ask Leora too, if you could assist again with bringing us home here with this reflection.
Thank you. Okay. So let's take one moment to think about one of those two questions, right? Because they're two really big questions. What types of messages are transmitted in your level of the school ecology, and how? And how might the messages be communicated about race or silence about race filter down to students? So I think Dr. Sunny, one of the theories in college and career culture is the theory of signaling theory. Which very much connects here, right? What are the images and words that we pick up on, even if they're not explicit, that tell us we matter or we don't matter? So I'm going to open it. So I know that from an earlier conversation, one of our colleagues said policy. So both at the 3 tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, from multi-tiered systems of support, and then also policy. So how many of our workplaces have explicit policy that address or acknowledge race-based stress and trauma or harm and healing? Right?
Yep.
Right. So we have someone else saying the discussion of race and culture is coded language that refers to SES. Yeah. So oftentimes when I work in schools and school districts, we say, oh, the SES kids, or they're low SES, or they're high SES. Okay, well, first of all, that's not person first language. And second of all, that's a code, right? Because we're meshing class and potentially trying to, especially if we're talking about Black and Brown students, we might be using class as a way to talk about race and racism. Yeah. Say you see bulletin boards showing more of one race, which doesn't speak about others. Okay, so if we had more time, we might be able to flesh that thought out a little bit more. And then we've got, thank you for naming this, discipline practices and disparity in discipline.
Yep, all great, great comments here. I think, again, just thinking about, again, how these things are happening across these different tiers within schools, I think are super important. And I wish we had more time to spend kind of processing and talking about it. But again, I want to make sure I'm keeping us on time here. And I know we're close to wrapping up. So I'll move us ahead, but if you all have questions or even comments that you think you want to get out and you want to say, I encourage you during the question and answer to make sure you share them. Or if you feel like I need to get them out now, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat box, and then we'll try our best to get to as many things as we can during the Q&A. So the other piece I'll just mention here as we're closing in on this, thinking about the school level racial socialization, is some things to think about is, the frequency of which these conversations are happening or not happening. I think it's important to think about the depth of it as well as the integration. So are the conversations happening on a very surface level where we're doing it to check the box, or are we going into depth, and are we providing opportunities to kind of sit with these conversations, really ponder and think about the policies, right? Thinking about what tools or what resources do we have available to support students, and recognizing that oftentimes we're conveying a lot of these messages jumbled up day to day. So if for those of us who have little ones, we can think about it directly within our own families. We can also think about how, again, it's happening in the workplace, how it's happening in our schools. But generally, one message isn't conveyed, especially for youth of color and families of color. Typically, it's a mixture of messages. And thinking about how kind of these messages might conflict or might, jive with messages that youth are getting in other settings, I think are important. And, we're not saying that all the responsibility is on schools and school personnel, but we are saying that schools have the opportunity to have a very impactful and meaningful role in the way that youth understand race and manage discrimination. And so I like to think about schools as a place that can promote healing when it comes to this. And so we want to focus our gaze onto how do we stop perpetuating racial stress in schools, and how can we think about healing. And so within that context, my colleagues and I have thought a lot about how do we promote this healthy racial climate across these different levels of the school ecology. So we're building on the trauma-informed school model, and we're thinking about resilience. And resilience is really focused on, how do we adapt in the face of adversity, in the face of trauma, right? In the face of all these stressors. And so when we're thinking about how to foster a healthy racial stress and trauma-informed school ecology, we're building on what's already really well known as these trauma-informed schools kind of practices and policies, but then we're also, we're also thinking about, how can staff reflect more on identity bias and kind of think about systemic issues that are happening in the world and are very present both at the school level and societal level, and how can we work on addressing those things. I think a part of it too is thinking about our conflict resolution skills as it comes to race. Some people have a really hard time with managing conflict that is race-based. So how can we improve in that area? How can we create a culturally responsive environment and system, right, that's promoting these climates? How can we help promote racial literacy or racial socialization in a healthy way within these contexts? And then how are we reflecting on assessing and creating policies and practices that are mindful of these racial inequities or racial bias, and again, working towards promoting a healthy school racial climate. If we had more time, I could dive into that much more, but I think that those are some kind of tools or resources and areas of reflection for us to think about. I also want to just acknowledge this radical healing framework that I think can be a good tool and resource for us to think about when we're considering ways to address and manage race-related stress in school. So the radical healing framework was developed by a group of psychologists, and it really involves being or becoming kind of whole in the space of identity-based wounds. Excuse me. And so these are really thinking about the injuries that are sustained because of membership in one's oppressed ethnic or racial minority group. And so within this radical healing framework, there are a lot of different things discussed within it. I think a big piece of it is, thinking about how do we maintain radical hope, for example. And we can think about radical hope as reflecting on, okay, well, even though a lot of times people reflect back to their ancestors. So how did they manage very difficult or challenging racial times and climate? And how can I think about ways that we have a more hopeful future? How can you reflect on kind of this idea of, again, being mindful of ways that you can contribute to healing in promoting change. Also thinking about ways you can help promote pride in your own group if you're a person of color, and then also appreciation if you're from another group. I think a part of this is also sharing your story, right? So finding a safe environment or person to share these stories, related to race and stress that can provide an opportunity to heal. Another piece of this is kind of thinking about how to educate yourself on different issues and identify groups that are really working to address these issues. And then also maintaining self-care, right? So thinking about opportunities to take care of yourself in the midst of this work, because this work can be challenging. It can be hard, especially if you if you're a person of color who might be experiencing these things. And also if you're, an ally who wants to support and help, I think finding your place in that and the best way to go about it can be challenging in itself too. And so trying to figure out how can we work together again to promote this climate. I'll just quickly mention, I don't have time to go into it. Transform is an intervention that my colleagues and I developed that's really focused on addressing general and race-specific stress and trauma, both within the school setting and within juvenile justice. We're in the place of trying to get the final touches put on it to start piloting it in schools and juvenile justice. But we do build on this radical healing framework that I think is really helpful to the process of healing and addressing racial stress and general trauma within the school context. And I think that the other thing I'll leave you with is there's a lot of great resources out there that can help both at that individual level and different levels of the school ecology. I guess, let's look at time. So I will call out two here. So one is American Psychological Association has a racial socialization initiative, and it's really focused on bringing attention to the importance of racial socialization. And I can quickly pull that up. So you can go to RES, I think it's APA.org/RES, racial ethnic socialization. There's great resources on here about, what is racial socialization? Why is it important? And I think that this is a wonderful resource that you all can feel free to use. There's also, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Teaching Tolerance. They have wonderful resources related to schools in terms of addressing race and discrimination and several other things. And I think being creative in the ways that we're doing this, either directly on the ground in schools or again at these higher levels that many of you are within, and being kind of thoughtful about that. I realize we are running low on time. So the last couple of things I'll say is just the importance again at thinking about how at multiple levels of the school ecology, how we can begin to feel comfortable and prepared to reflect on and address racial stress and foster these healthy racial climates, and how we can put practices into place that really focus on support and advocacy and training around these issues is very important across those different levels of the school ecology. And I think we'll probably have to skip this reflection. And Leora, you can let me know if you want to spend some time on it, maybe if there's no Q&A. But I would encourage you to kind of think about the work that you do and how within your level of school ecology, how does this work apply, right? How might you translate some of the learnings today into your daily work role? And then how can you help also increase your own comfort in addressing race and promoting a healthy school racial climate? So I want to turn it over to the Q&A session to make sure we have a little bit of time.
We don't actually, unfortunately, because we have to close really at 4:30. But I will say this, Dr. Salim, the good news is that as Adrienne Marie Brown says, there's always time for the work. So I just wanted to name that there was one question that came up around like, how do we get your contact? How do we get the publication that the article that you are working to publish on Transform, and then I think I also saw a question around how to support family and children partnerships. So I think this is the time to include, yeah, exactly. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, and I will mention that I am a little backlogged with emails, so it might take me a little bit to respond. Feel free to send emails, and I will get back with you. We'll also have a modified version of the PowerPoints that we can share with folks who attended today. So you will have resources there. I'm happy to send out a reference link to the articles that are published. Transform we don't have a paper published on it yet because we just developed the intervention, and so we're starting to slowly pilot within schools. But I'm happy to provide information on that too if you all are interested. So you can feel free to reach out.
Thanks, Dr. Salim. So I want to talk about a couple closings. So first of all, I wanted to do a huge thank you to Dr. Salim and really encourage you to put in the chat box one takeaway, one gratitude. The questions that we didn't get to will be uploaded, and they are 100% questions that you can bring for your own reflection and for your own team and your faculty work. So nothing is lost, all is gained in this work. And I want to mention very briefly some next steps. So I just wanted to name on Tuesday, we have our town hall. So that is with Susan Barrett and some of the other USD faculty. Unfortunately, Dr. Salim can't join us, but we'll have other faculty who can. So this is a culmination for the whole series for you to come in and hear all the faculty speak with each other and learn from each other. So we hope that you join us on Tuesday, and you can register on the same webpage that you've been registering for this. We also wanted to announce, this is really exciting for everyone online with us, that we are doing an 8-part learning series on the National School Mental Health Curriculum. So if you don't know about it, join us to learn more about it. And if you do know about it, join us to learn even more. So every session is going to have every session is going to focus on the 8 modules, the quality indicators of school mental health, and the focal audience is on district and county leaders, just like many of you. And every session will be followed by a regional breakout moderated by myself. So you'll get to meet each other and meet folks in your region. Thank you for naming this. This will all go out in a follow-up email. And then we also have consultation hours as a region. So if you would like to chat with me or with my colleague about something that came up for you today, or a question or a curiosity, please join us. This Monday is our next one from 3 to 4. You can drop in anytime. You've got to register, but let us know and come and say hi to us. Thank you. Yes. Okay. So we've got the self-care expectations and the radical healing framework stood out to me. So maybe, Dr. Salim, we can do more work on the radical healing framework. Thank you. We can advance. So all the webinars are cataloged. Olivia's putting more resources into the chat box. So you have we want to make sure you have all the things that you need. We also want to make sure that this was a really large conversation with so much content, research, and practice, and then ended with like a lot of, here's what's happening next. So if any of your brain and body is not integrating what I'm saying right now, that is A-okay, and you can go onto our website, you can contact me, you can contact our program manager, Olivia Rojas, and we will make sure that you get the information you need. And we just encourage you to follow us on social media. And just again, want to do a massive thank you to you. We know that your time is full of asks and full of interest in this moment and for those that we serve. So on behalf of everyone who attended today, I want to say thank you to you and to your colleagues for codifying the wisdom that helps us move this work forward with grace and courage. I really want to thank everyone in the chat box who either contributed or was contributing here, was either contributing here or here, and was present. We had between 50 to 75 folks at any point in time tuning in, and your impact is felt. Thank you so much. We'll see you on Tuesday. Join us so you can put more asterisks in the chat box. Please fill out an evaluation so we know if you want to hear more and learn more moving ahead. And with that, I'm going to encourage Livia to end our recording and be well. Be safe and be well.